So do you really need to sign a contract in order to have a real estate agent help you buy a home in Hampton Roads, Virginia? The answer is yes and no, and maybe it's in your best interest. Hear me out. Where did these buyer brokers come and why? So a long time ago, way back in the old days, there were towns and then there would be land around the towns. And if Rancher Joe owned 100 acres of land and he decided he wanted to sell 40 acres down by the river, Rancher Joe would come to town and he'd go to the tavern. And he would tell the tavern keeper, who was Mike, he'd say, "Hey, Mike, I want to sell 40 acres down by the river. If anybody comes to town looking for land, would you please tell them I have this property for sale? If you send me over the buyer, I'll give you a little cut," which would be a commission. Well, then Tavern Mike found out that saloon keeper Sally in the next town over, she was doing the same thing for her folks that were coming in from out of town. Mike says to Sally, "Hey, look, I'll share my list of people that want to sell if you'll share your list of people, and if we have buyers, we share, and whatever the amount of money is that the owner is giving us, we'll just split it." And so Sally says, "Sure." And this starts what we call as the multiple listing service. Now, both Sally and Mike are getting paid from Rancher Joe to Mike. So Sally really works for the rancher. She doesn't work for the buyer. The buyer comes in and says, "Hey, anybody's looking to sell?" And she says, "Yeah, I do, next town over." Well, fast forward, time goes on and the VA starts and houses start being a common thing in America to be able to buy and sell, and you get subdivisions and the boom after World War II, and it continues on into the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. And people would go into their local real estate company and they would get an agent to help them buy a house. But that agent still actually worked for the seller. They worked with the list agent. They were considered, technically it was called being a sub-agent of the list agent. So their fiduciary responsibility was to the list agent and to the seller. So theoretically, if you were a buyer and you walked in the local real estate office and said, "Hey, I want to buy a house," that person was helping you, but anything you told them could be used against you in the negotiation because they work for the seller and they should tell the seller. So if you saw a house and it was $100,000 and you go to see it and you want to buy it and you love this house and you look at the agent that took you to see it and you go, "Oh my gosh, I love this house so much. I'd pay $120,000 to buy this house. But let's offer $80,000. Well, they would write your offer up for you and then they would give it to the listing agent. Legally, they would have to tell that listing agent what they knew from you. "Hey, we're offering 80, but they said they'd spend up to $120,000. Well, so time goes on and the buyers start to figure out that they're getting the short end of the stick in this negotiation because nobody represents them. All the parties represent the seller. Well, seller was paying the commission, so the seller felt like they had that. But in the 90s, with courts and stuff, it finally came out like somebody needs to tell these buyers what's going on, and so the buyer can have their own representation. And thus is born the exclusive right to represent. Now, in doing that, you now have the right as a buyer to go in and hire your own real estate agent. You have the right to now have those representations. It's not tied to the fiduciary monetary responsibilities to the seller anymore. And that started in the 90s, probably more like in California, and then it spread into other places as a consumer right. And in Virginia, it was adopted as our Commonwealth law about 2006 or 7. In order to be able to do certain things, the relationship can no longer be assumed. In order to have a client relationship, it has to be in writing. And for that, when it goes into writing, it says what the responsibilities of the agent is to you. And some of those things that are in that contract states that the agent will represent you as the buyer in your sole intent to purchase property, okay? It gives the ability for the agent to advise you. If you don't have that agreement and you just go meet an agent off the street and go look at a house, they really don't have the right to advise you on what to do. And if they do advise you, it may or may not be the right advice because they haven't signed an agreement to be your agent. You also would have the right to negotiate for you. So you're giving, when you sign up with an agent, you're giving them the right to negotiate on your behalf, of course, at terms that are acceptable to you. And then I think what's most important is that you are given confidentiality. So that's financial confidentiality. That's do I love the house confidentiality. It doesn't matter what it is. If you tell something to your real estate agent, you can say to them, this is confidential and I expect it to go nowhere other than here. And that agent has to respect that confidentiality, not just for the period of the contract and not just for the period of buying a home, but forever and ever, amen. So when people ask me, do I have to sign this contract? The answer again is no, yeah. And why would you not want to? Because there's so many protections in there for you, the consumer, than there is for the agent. And if your agent is not having this conversation with you to begin with and is not explaining that to you from the beginning, maybe you need to interview some other agents. Okay? If you're in the process of looking for a home in Hampton Roads, Virginia, we would love to talk to you about the opportunity to become your agent. Thanks.